Isaiah chapters 31 to 37 today, and I think this is the longest chunk of Isaiah I've done in one sitting so far, largely because it starts off, there's not much happening for a little bit, but then it all kicks back in again and we get some more interesting ideas to look at. We start with, God will be the foundation of life and a rich source of salvation, wisdom and knowledge. And it goes on to say that fear of the Lord is the key to this treasure. If you recall, fear of the Lord we established is just humility before God, So it's not actually fear. That's an interesting idea though, isn't it? Because I guess you've got the idea of, salvation would make sense as being a thing from God. Wisdom, even to some extent, how best to live your life. If you study the Bible and it turns out that's true, you could figure out, I guess. But knowledge, I guess, how could knowledge... Because it's difficult to know what can you really know about God. And with reference to the Bible, sure, but there's nothing to actually... You can't apply a scientific methodology to it or anything, can you? So I guess perhaps that doesn't matter, but it's an interesting idea and question. In chapter 34, verse 4, we have all the stars in the sky will be dissolved, which is really interesting, isn't it? Because you think that could be one of the futures for the universe. Scientific understanding now sort of shows that if everything keeps expanding, the universe tears itself apart and it just goes cold. So you could see that as the stars dissolving. But I feel like that would be a bit too much to say that that's a scientific prediction for the future. It seems unlikely. So I assume that's just a case of a metaphor applied that just happens to line up with actual scientific truth later on, or a potential scientific truth later on. Of chapter 34, verses 5 to 7, I'm going to read again, just because that same idea of just to illustrate what I'm up against and how hard I'm working for everybody to try and translate this stuff. We have, my sword has drunk its fill in the heavens. See, it descends in judgment on Edom, the people I have totally destroyed. The word of the Lord is bathed in blood, it is covered in fat, the blood of lambs and goats, fat from the kidneys of rams. For the Lord has a sacrifice in Bozrah and a great slaughter in the land of Edom. And the wild oxen will fall with them, the bull calves and the great bulls. Their land will be drenched with blood, and the dust will be soaked with fat. I mean, do you see what I'm trying to tangle with here? I have picked that out as being a sort of particularly weird bit in that, a bit dramatic. But it all reads a lot like that. So you can see why people haven't generally read the Bible, because it is not easy to read this thing. Chapter 35 anyway, we have wilderness will rejoice and blossom. So this is basically once judgment's happened and everything goes good again. And it's a nice idea, isn't it? The wilderness, so going to blossom. So you can imagine the Sahara Desert suddenly starts growing stuff and things like that. And that ties into the idea that we talked about previously, that vipers aren't going to bite anymore and everything's going to be great. But it does, rather unhelpfully, it talks about the wilderness will shout for joy. The Sahara Desert is not going to shout for joy, is it? So again, we've got a very metaphorical thing going on there. And of course, okay, it's metaphorically illustrating something positive, but does it also mean that the blossoming is going to be metaphorical as well? Like in the new creation heaven idea, is the Sahara Desert going to be full of sand? Or it's sort of not very practical for a left-brained person like me, which is sort of annoying. Verse 4 of chapter 35 talks about God will come with vengeance and divine retribution to save you. And I quite like that, because it's really easy to look at all this wrath stuff as just God being angry and horrible, which I know is basically how the Old Testament is characterised. But it's not particularly fair. I mean, in that sense, if you look at it as God seems to be angry at all the things that are wrong in the world, which largely are people-driven, and you can sort of see him in that context being angry about things in the same way as we might be angry about an injustice or something like that. And it's not easy to see it that way, I think, because most of it does seem to just God's wrathful and people are getting smited and all sorts of things. Not for a while, I suppose, to be fair. But always with good cause. And you put it all together, or you zoom out and get the big picture. And it does look more like that. So if you do read it properly, for want of a better word, that obviously sounds somewhat self-congratulatory, which is not my intention. But you do get a lot of people seem to read the Bible, or claim to have read the Bible, and then recount it in a way that just makes no sense. Like a surface reading of this stuff is just never going to make any sense. Verse 5 talks about the end of all physical disability, which is excellent. So I've got a heat patch on my back at this very moment. It's difficult to keep a straight face sometimes when I move. Verse 19 clarifies that those that the Lord has rescued will enter Zion. Zion seems to be interchangeable with Jerusalem, but we are talking post-death and judgment, so Jerusalem's going to be there, with everlasting joy. So we can rule out it's not a Borg future. As in, previously we were looking at this and it sounds like all the bad stuff was going to be taken away, but it wasn't clear that heaven wasn't just going to be boring. This does seem to suggest, well, does blatantly state that heaven is going to be full of everlasting joy, but also that we're all going to be in Jerusalem. I've never been to Jerusalem, but yeah, I get the metaphor makes it so difficult. I mean, I don't think we're literally talking everybody cramming into Jerusalem, because I don't think it's that big. Yeah, I think just Jerusalem being God's sacred place, and then maybe the whole earth becomes Jerusalem, or something like that. We then come on to the king of Assyria, who we're reminded is Sennacherib, and we talk about he is asking the king of Judah, Hezekiah at this point, very nicely if he'll just like surrender and just not have to have a battle. He does seem to do it quite nicely. Hezekiah's not keen on this, and there's a brief mention in this that Sennacherib is saying that there's no point waiting, hoping your God is going to deliver you, because it's your God who's told me the one to come and kick you out. Which ties up nicely with that idea that God's saying previously somewhere that Assyria was going to be the tool with which God uses to kick the Israelites out of Judah. But then the Assyrians are going to think it's because they're clever, so God is going to have to punish them for their haughty eyes and all that sort of thing. And then chapter 37, it talks about Isaiah in the third person, which I think it is done throughout, but suddenly I noticed that. I was like, hang on, is this Isaiah is supposed to have written this? And it occurred I hadn't looked up what was happening with Isaiah and did he write it. And it's really interesting for Isaiah. There seems to be a lot of debate about whether Isaiah actually wrote it or did someone else write it. And there seems to be this key theory that it's written by 3 different people. And you dig into it, and it seems that the reason there are a lot of biblical scholars, atheist ones, think that 3 people wrote it is because the predictions are so good that it couldn't possibly have been actual prophecy. It had to have been written after the events that happened. And it's really interesting that, isn't it? Because there's an implicit acceptance that the predictions are just that good. And it's sort of interesting. At the same time, I don't think it particularly matters for our purposes, because we can't prove it either way. I think the interesting thing about Isaiah is it seems to predict Jesus, and we know for a fact it was, regardless of whether 3 people wrote it and it was written over hundreds of years, it was definitely written before Jesus was born, because we have a copy of it that dates back to a couple hundred years before that. So, yeah, I don't think there's much we can really do with that, but it's just vaguely interesting, albeit it does raise a question you couldn't use as evidence that Isaiah was profound because he predicted the Babylonian exile, because there's a chance that someone else wrote it after that had already happened. From there, anyway, Sennacherib is told that he's basically going to chicken out and run off home, and then when he gets there, someone's going to kill him, which ties back to something we looked at in 2 Kings, I think it was, episode something. So it's interesting that we're getting a parallel with a previous bit we've already looked at, albeit Isaiah and Hezekiah were there at the same time. So just because it comes chronologically later in the Bible, it's still writing about the same events. But yeah, so that's more interesting stuff with Isaiah. On we will go and see what else we can find.